There's a three-letter word that we use a lot. That we say it a lot, but we also just, by the way we act, sometimes we are living this word out even without realizing that we're saying the word, and that word is yes, right? Yes. How many of you have gotten in trouble by saying or acting the word yes out? How many of you guys have gotten in trouble by just saying yes? How many of you, the greatest thing in your life happened because you said yes? That should be pretty much all of us, right? How many of you, the craziest thing has happened in your life because you said yes, right? We say that word or we live that word yes out, and it is an active thing, isn't it? There's nothing passive when it comes to saying yes. Usually it means that we move into something, we're moving into something, we're acting upon something, or something's acted upon us, right? Yes is a powerful, powerful word. But we understand that when we say yes to something, that we are automatically saying no to something else, right? If we say yes to going to the store, we're saying no to staying home, right? That's just a life thing, right? Whenever we say the word yes, and whenever we step into something or we walk into something, we are saying no to some other things. When we say, and what we need to understand is that word yes is so powerful and vital to understand what we should say yes to. Because I think that when it comes to this idea of faith, and we're going to talk about this and kind of unpack this throughout this entire message today, that when we say yes to God, we're saying yes to faith. We're walking in faith when we say yes to God. And so sometimes faith is about what are we saying yes to? And in relation to that, what are we saying no to? See, faith is one of those things that's easy to talk about, it's easy to preach about, because it's easy to sing about. We sang songs about faith today, right? And it's pretty easy to sing about faith. Like, we can just declare faith. We can talk about faith. We can preach about faith. That's one of the easiest things for preachers to preach about, because there's just tons of examples throughout the Bible. But to live out faith and to live in faith, that becomes a little harder, right? It becomes something that's, okay, it's easy to talk about, but then when it actually comes to defining, what does it mean to live by faith? Whew, well, don't get all Bible college-y on us, Joel. I mean, what does that mean? It's harder to live out. And when we often think of faith, when we talk about faith, we think of it as a belief system, right? Well, what faith do you profess? Or what is your faith in? And we think of it as a belief system, which there's nothing wrong. It is a belief system. But I think what we'll find is when we look through the Bible, that it's not as much about a belief system as it is a way of living our life out. Faith is a very active word, and it's a very active thing in our life, just like the word yes is a very active thing. It's not a passive thing. Faith is not a passive thing. It's not something that we just sit and say, well, that's what I believe, because if we stop with just, well, that's what I believe, then we're talking about belief, we're not talking about faith, because faith is belief in action. Right? And so what we're going to look at here this morning is this, that I want us to look at faith not as as something that is there to be had, or something that's there to be seen as a distant thing, but something that we're actually walking in, actually living out, actually believing in, and that changes the way that we move through our life. That we're constantly choosing to say yes when God is calling us to walk and take steps. Hebrews chapter 11, known as the faith chapter. And we're going to start there this morning because it's kind of what I've been trying to say this morning in Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen." Okay, so this is the definition of faith according to the writer of Hebrews. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith, we understand that the universe was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. And then he's going to go on. But what we see here in verse 3, he says, verse 3 has to do with belief, right? For we understand that by faith, the universe was created by the Word of God. None of us were there, right, to see that. So we're like, yeah, I believe that, not because I've seen it, but because God's Word tells me about it. But then going on from there, verse 4 on in the book of Hebrews goes on to talk us about example after example after example of people who didn't just say, well, I believe that the universe was formed by God, and that's good for you, and that's good for me, and then just sit there. But it was a group of people who believed in God, and because of their belief in God, they had the faith and the action to walk it out and what that looks like. And as we read through Hebrews 11, right, there's story after story after story of people of faith. And we're going to look at one of them a little bit later on today. But the whole reason this come up and that I was thinking about this is I've been reading in the book of Matthew just in my personal time. And the guys, if you've been part of Man Up, you've been reading through Matthew with me. And we've been just going one chapter a day through the book of Matthew. And we're about ready to launch into Mark. We're kind of closing down Matthew this week and we're heading on to Mark. And what I've been so struck with as I've reread through the book of Matthew is how often Jesus comments on people's faith or lack of faith. It's like this constant, like Jesus is just recognizing aloud to people, and he's constantly saying, well, you had faith, and he's commending people for their faith, or he's blown away by people's lack of faith. He's either like, wow, there's, right, the Roman centurion who came and his daughter was sick, and he says, you just say the word, Jesus, and I know that they're going to be healed, right? And he's like, to this Roman centurion, he's like, I have not seen this faith anywhere in Israel. Jesus was astonished by this man's faith. And then just a couple chapters later, he goes into his hometown and he's hanging out in his hometown, and he comments and he says, he marvels at their lack of faith. He constantly talks to some people like, your faith has made you well, when he heals somebody, right? Whenever he heals somebody, Jesus would often say, your faith has made you well. And then he would look at his disciples in a moment where they didn't step and rise up, and he said, where is your faith? And he would rebuke them for their lack of faith. And it just struck me that Jesus constantly recognized people's either faith in an active way or their lack of faith and the way they lived very passively. And I got to thinking about my life and about our lives. Let me ask you, by the way you're living your life right now, do you think Jesus would be astonished and commend you for your faith? Or would he marvel at your lack of faith by just the way you're living your life right now? And boy, that question has kind of stuck with me the last couple weeks. It's just kind of been one of those penetrating questions. Would Jesus look at the way I'm living my life and commend me for my faith? Or would he be amazed at my lack of faith? You see, just a few verses later in Hebrews 11:6, it says this, and without faith it's impossible to please him, that's God. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So he says, if we don't have faith, if we're not walking our faith out, he says it's impossible to please him. So this idea of our faith and walking our faith out becomes very important, right? He says, whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So I want to examine our faith this morning. And I want us to leave here with a bigger, not just a bigger understanding of faith, but some real conviction or some real practical ways that we could live out our faith as we journey into our week. And that we might just be struck with that question, man, with the way I'm living my life, would Jesus recognize the faith that I have by the way that I walk out my life? Or would he marvel at my lack of faith? In Hebrews 11 here, like I've said, it goes on. In fact, we joke at Bible college that Hebrews 11 is the hall of faith because it talks about all these incredible people of faith. But what we find as we read through the book of Hebrews, because I don't know if you do this or not, but when I read through the Bible and I see these incredible characters in the Bible, like Moses and Abraham and David and I look at them and I'm like, I could never be like them, right? They're like superheroes, right? Like the Apostle Paul and a little bit later on and Peter. Those guys are like superheroes. I could never do what they did. I mean, that just seems out of reach. They were like super followers of God, right? And you see my life lately? Like, there's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of things. If God wanted me to do that, he'd have given me a better gift, or he wouldn't have made me so messed up, right? I couldn't do what they're doing. But as we read through this thing, we talk about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and David and these guys. We got to recognize, friends, that these guys were messed up dudes, right? They were ordinary people, and they were kind of messed up, right? They had weaknesses. They had things that held them back. They had sin problems in their life. They had physical problems that slowed them down. And like what the Apostle Paul says, he says, I'm going to boast in my weakness, because in my weakness, God is made strong. So I want us to learn this morning that weak is really the new strong. And that being broken and fragile really doesn't disqualify us, and in fact, it helps us. Because we recognize then that the power is not coming through us, but through him. If we look at this hall of faith, one of them was a prostitute. One of them had a terrible home life and background. Moses couldn't talk well. He stuttered a lot. He couldn't speak. God used him in pretty crazy ways, right? There were fatherless men and women. There were people with tremendous earthly challenges, and they faced what seemed to be insurmountable odds, but God raised them up. Why? What was so special about them? They kept saying yes when God continued to ask them to walk. They just kept saying yes. And sometimes they'd say no, and God'd be like, no, you can do it. And they'd say yes. And they'd say yes, and it wasn't a pretty walk, but God used them to do incredible things because they kept saying yes. I love a lot of the characters, but I love when we get to the end of Hebrews 11 and starting in verse 32 when it says this, "And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets. He's like, I would love to, the writer of Hebrews, after he goes through all these people and recounting their faith, he's like, I could go on for days telling you about these people that I love to just talk about their faith, but time wouldn't let me to tell you of these guys. They said, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. What? That sounds pretty awesome, right? As my 3-year-old daughter would say what? That's crazy. Like that, if we could just daydream, right? Like take us back to like being when we were kids and like daydreaming about like what we wanted to be, what we wanted to do, what we wanted to accomplish. Boy, conquering kingdoms, enforcing justice, obtaining promises, stopping the mouths of lions, quench the power of fire, escape the edge of the sword. That I'm in, right? I'm in. That sounds awesome. What qualifies me for that? What qualifies me for doing that? Because I want to do that. They were made strong out of their weakness. That's what qualified them. That's what qualified them, is that they were made strong out of their weakness. These were ordinary people. These were ordinary men and women who kept saying yes when God kept calling them. And they got to see incredible things, not because of their strength, but because they were made strong by Him out of their weakness. And one of the things the Bible says is that they were living when they died. Isn't that a profound statement? That they were living when they died. They weren't just eking out an existence. They weren't just waiting to die. They weren't just mailing it in until heaven one day. They were living by faith. They were out there living on the edge. They were living life. Yes, they were longing for a better place, and they were living with heaven in their sights, but that gave them the confidence to do and to live by faith here on earth. And friends, sometimes we get into this thing where we just kind of are eking out life, and we're just kind of mailed it in, and we're waiting on heaven. And yes, it's important to live with heaven in sight and longing for a better place and longing for that. But God's called us and gave us an incredible mission here on earth. And He's called us to live this life with a faith that takes us out on the edge and gives us boldness to live life. And that starts with learning to say yes when God calls you to step out in faith. We're going to turn back from Hebrews back to the book of Judges, to a guy that was mentioned in this passage. One of my favorite Old Testament characters, and because I find myself in his story, and Gideon is just one of my favorite characters in the Old Testament. And when we find Gideon, so this is in Judges chapter 6, if you want to turn back there. And in fact, I want to encourage you, we're just going to kind of highlight Gideon's life, but I want you to go home today and read Gideon, the story of Gideon in Judges chapter 6 and 7. It's just an incredible story. But we find Gideon in verse 11 of chapter 6. And here's what we find him doing. Now, the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, not Oprah, Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, I think that's how we can say that, while his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide from the Midianites. All right, we're one verse in and already it's weird. Because I agree. Because why would God go to that guy? Right? Gideon, it says that the angel of the Lord, which if we go through Old Testament and we look at this title angel of the Lord, typically when that word terminology would come up, this indicates that God himself, Jesus, before he came in the flesh and came to earth and lived a sinless life, the Jesus we read about in the Gospels, back in the Old Testament, whenever he would show up, it would say, the Old Testament would say an angel of the Lord appeared. And so the angel of the Lord that here, likely Jesus, shows up to Gideon here. Why would he get to see him? Why would he show up to this guy? Why would he show up in this moment to this guy? He's already told us, the Bible just told us that Gideon was sitting in a wine press because he was hiding from the Midianites. He was hiding from the army. Essentially, he was hiding because he's the biggest wuss in town. He's sitting there trying to get some food, but primarily his purpose was to hide. The context of the story is that God allowed the Midianites to come in and conquer his people because of their sin against him. And so the Midianites were oppressing, and they were coming in and they would oppress the people of God. They were under... and so this guy, Gideon, we're going to find out he was the weakest guy in the weakest tribe, and he's the weakest guy in his family. And he's sitting there hiding like a total wuss because he's scared of the armies that are outside. And God shows up to him. And I think that's good news for us. Because I think that there's a lot of us sitting in a lot of caves, which is that's what a wine press was a cave. A lot of us are sitting in caves, scared. And the fact that God shows up to Gideon in this moment means that he's going to show up for us. He's going to show up to us broken people. Because God doesn't want us to just rely on him for our eternal salvation. He wants us to rely on him for every moment of every day and how we live our lives. So he shows up, and then he says this, which gets even more ridiculous. It says this: the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." Now, when he says this, I'm guessing that Gideon was like, "You just caught me hiding like a total pansy. And you launch in, oh mighty man of valor." And valor literally means brave in the face of battle. What is he doing? He's hiding because his friends and his family members are out there in battle, and he's hiding. And yet God says to him, "Oh mighty man of valor." We know that God never lies and God never exaggerates because it's just a form of lying. But why does God go to him? Why does God go to Gideon? Now, if I was God, and that's a dangerous statement, I understand that. But if I was God, I would go to like Chuck Norris, right? Bruce Lee, Bruce Willis for that matter, Jason Statham, anybody, right? Like, oh mighty, I would say like, hey, I'd come to him and say, "Oh mighty man of valor," right? But God goes to this guy who's broken and weak, whose father has fallen away and a sellout, and he calls him mighty man of valor. And he comes to you and I at times when we don't feel strong. And he says, "Hey, you're a mighty person of valor. You're a mighty man of valor. You're a mighty woman of valor." Because God has seen what he's already won for Gideon, and he's already seen what he's won for us. And if we walk into that, he's seen it. He's seen what Gideon could be far before Gideon could ever see what Gideon was going to be. And so he comes to Gideon, he comes to you and I, and he says, "I see what is there for you if you walk into it. I see what I've already won for you. And you just see yourself, and the world just sees you often as somebody that's hunkered down in the cave, who's not bold, who's fear-filled, who's got mental illness problems, or who has physical illness problems, or who has family problems, or past problems, or sin problems, and we say, I'm disqualified from being used by God. And we often disqualify ourselves far before God ever disqualifies us. Gideon had already tapped out. He's already disqualified himself. He's already lived up to his family's reputation of him, that he's already claimed it, and he's already using it. And God's like, I'm not going to let you do that, Gideon, because I've seen something more for you. And too often what I find is people disqualify themselves from what God has for them, or for the ministry and the mission that God wants to have them on, and they give me all sorts of excuses, whether it's mental health issues, physical health issues, sin, past problems, family issues, whatever it may be, personality issues, and they say, I'm disqualified. And what I'm saying is that God doesn't disqualify you. He wants you to start walking by faith, and he's going to come find you and invite you into his story. So what excuses are you using? Like Gideon, that God's like, I see something more for you. Story goes on. And Gideon said to him, please, sir, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? Again, he's still just using excuses, right? And where are all his wonderful deeds that our fathers recounted to us, saying, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and given us into the hand of Midian. And the Lord turned to him and said, go in this might of yours, and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Do not I send you? I love that question. He commissions him, and then he says, do not I send you? I could have chosen anybody else, but I came to you, Gideon. Go in this might of yours and save Israel. Do I not send you? And he says this, and he said to him, please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. Again, he just keeps throwing up every reason why he can't be used by God. Maybe you've been in this place where you've had this conversation with God, where he's calling you to step out in faith, and you just used everything that you possibly can, every excuse you have, but I can't do that because I have this. Well, I can't do that because of this. Well, I can't do that because of this. And God, the angel Lord here, he just keeps pressing. He's like, nope, let's knock that excuse down. Let's knock that excuse down. He says, and the Lord said to him, but I will be with you, and you shall strike down the Midianites as one man. God comes to this guy who's the weakest and hiding and terrible family, and the guy that just continually says, I can't do it, and God keeps saying, no, listen, I'll be with you. You just step out, I'll be with you. You just step out and go, I got your back. You just say yes. And I will be strong in your place of your weakness. And he goes through a series of tests. But the first test that the angel of the Lord sends him to, before he goes on to striking down the army of Midian, almost single-handedly, he says, I want you to go back to your dad's house. You see, if you know the story of Gideon afterwards, you know that Gideon is known throughout the history of Israel as this incredible judge who conquered the enemy and delivered God's people out. But what we need to see, before he could do that, he had to go deal with his past, and he had to go stand up to his family. You see, his dad and his brothers, his whole family, they had sold out to false gods. And they were worshiping false gods, And his dad had put up an Asherah pole, which is essentially an altar to a false god of that time. His family would worship at the Asherah pole and bow down to false gods. And God sent him back to his dad's house to deal with his dad issues before he stuck him in the fight for his people. And here's what he did. It's really funny, his story. We're not going to read it. I'll just tell you, but I encourage you to go back and read it. So he says, I want you to go back and I want you to go confront your dad about this thing that he's doing, this worshiping false gods. I want you to go cut down that Asherah pole, and I want you to confront your dad. So here's what Gideon did. He grabbed 10 of his friends. I don't recall the angel of the Lord telling him to do that, but I guess it's like that thing, if like you're going to go walking through bear-infested woods, right? You take slower people than you because you can outrun them, right? So like I'm guessing that Gideon got like 10 of his friends, and most of them were slower than him, right? Because if somebody was going to get caught, it wasn't going to be him. And then Gideon, with his 10 friends, this warrior, this mighty man of valor, this guy that's going to deliver Israel from the hand of Midian, goes at night with his 10 friends to cut down the Asherah pole at his dad's house. Because he's still scared. You see, isn't that just the story of faith? He gets up from this wine press. All right, I believe, I'm going to do it. I can do it. Okay, go confront your dad. Oh. And he takes a couple steps back and reverts back to that wuss that was sitting in the cave. But he's on this journey of faith, isn't he? Because he doesn't totally go back there. He goes and he does it at night with 10 friends, but he does it. And then I want you to notice, so he cuts down this pole, and then the next thing, the morning comes, and the whole town's thrown into chaos, right? And his family is, and what's so interesting is they wake up and they keep asking this profound question: who has done this, right? Who's cut down this pole? Who's brought this upon us? And you know, here's why this is so huge. It's because no one thought it was Gideon. I mean, they probably listed everybody in town other than Gideon. No way. You seen Gideon? He was in the cave. I saw him in the cave. Everybody else was battling. No, Gideon was not by reputation someone who had the guts to do this, right? He wasn't like Chuck Norris who could come karate chop the pole down at night, right? Like, it wasn't, he didn't have the reputation. But God was slowly transforming his heart, and slowly transforming his reputation, and slowly transforming what he thought of himself. And as you continue to read, you just see Gideon getting more and more bold and more. Every little step that he said yes to in his faith journey, he kept getting more and more bold in it. So then we fast forward down to verse 34, and it says the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and at that point he blows this trumpet because it's time to go to battle, and it's been now, his reputation's been transformed. God's chosen him to be the commander who's going to take the army of Israel and take them into battle against the Midianites to defeat the Midianites. And so they blow this trumpet, and 32,000 men of Israel come gathering behind Gideon, right? Gathering behind the wuss that sat in the cave but has been transformed into this mighty man of valor. He's starting to believe what God is saying about him, right? He's starting to believe these words, and so he's got 32,000 guys that come and say, we'll fight behind you, Gideon. That's got to be a confidence booster, right? Like, hey, I've now, like, everybody believes in me. And God comes to Gideon, and he's feeling pretty good, and God speaks to him, and he challenges him again. He's like, Gideon, 32,000, that's too much. No, it's not. Yes, it is. No, it's not. Yes, it is. You see, Gideon, if you have 32,000 men and you guys go down and defeat Midian, it's going to be about you and how good you are. And I want the story to be about how good I am, Gideon, not how good you are. So why don't you do this, Gideon? Why don't you get up and stand up and say, if any of you are scared, just go on home. And Gideon's got to be feeling pretty good. Like, okay, maybe a few pansies will get out of here, like, how I was. But so Gideon stands up and he says, hey, if any of you guys are scared, you can go on and head on home. 22,000 men leave. It's like mass exodus, right? And if there was ever a time for Gideon to shrink back into cave mentality, it was now. But he takes a deep breath and he's like, okay, well, I guess. And God comes to him again. He says, Gideon, you have 10,000. That's still too many. No, it's not. Yes, it is. No, it's not. Yes, it is. Here's what I want you to do. Give another test. What I want you to do is take all the 10,000 down to the river, the water's edge, and I want you to have them drink. And if take a drink, and if they, guys that put their head all the way down and drink directly out, or the guys that scoop up, and get the guys into two different groups. And so he takes them down there, and there's a group of 9,700 guys that drink one way, and he puts them off to the other side, and there's 300 guys that drink the other way, and he puts them off to this side. And God says, okay, time to get rid of a group. And so he goes to the 9,700 and says, well, it's been good. And God's like, no, wrong group. Or he goes over to 300. God, and he's like, I want you to go dismiss the 9,700. Send them home. So he does. And God says, that's perfect. That's perfect. 300 guys. Against an entire army of Midianites. And God says, that's perfect. Because now the story will be, God delivered us, not Gideon delivered us. And isn't it just like God to continue to call us deeper into faith? And I guarantee if you examine your faith story, your faith journey, there's been moments where it didn't seem like God knew what he was doing. But God's always known what he's doing, and he continually calls us. And if you know the rest of the story, it's a pretty incredible story. But God does something for Gideon. He invites Gideon to go down and check out the camp of the Midianites. And it's interesting that he sneaks down. Gideon and a couple buddies sneak down. He's getting really good at sneaking around at night. And so he sneaks down to the camp of Midian, and he's sitting there listening to these guys in camp talk. And he's down there by their tents, and one Midianite says to another, I know it sounds like a joke, it's not. One Midianite says to another, I had this dream that this small loaf of barley bread rolled down the hill and knocked over an army tent of Midian. And his friend said this, that could only be the hand of Gideon. That could only be the hand of Gideon. So just in a short time, God had taken this man who was hiding from the Midianites and brought him through a series of tests, series of life events where he just kept saying yes, and sometimes he'd come back and he'd take a couple of steps back, and then God would invite him to take another step and say yes of faith, and another step of faith and say yes and yes. And he brought him to this place where now all of a sudden the army of Midian was fearful of this guy named Gideon and the God that worked through Gideon. If you read the rest of the story, that's exactly what happened. God comes through in an incredible fashion. You should read the rest of the story. And a group of 300 men take down this massive army through one guy who just continually says yes. Isn't it interesting that God used a barley loaf in that dream? Because if we fast forward a few thousand years, it's a boy that comes to Jesus with just a few barley loaves and a few fish. And through this little act of faith for this boy saying, I don't have much, but here's what I have, and you can have it, Jesus. Do with it what you want. Jesus feeds 5,000. And I think that that's so interesting that whenever we come to Jesus and say, here's what I have, it's not much. In fact, most of the time I feel like Gideon, but here's what I have. Take it and do what you want with it. He's going to invite us onto a journey where if we continually say yes to him, you will be amazed at where God will bring you through continually saying yes. The things that you didn't think were imaginable become possible through continually saying yes to God. I don't know where you're at in your life right now. I don't know what cave you're hiding in. I don't know how life's beat you up to the point where you say, I'm disqualified. But I do know something. If God can take a shy little redheaded preacher boy, the preacher's son, that never ever wanted to be on stage, who has a problem reading and talking in public, and who forever never wanted to step foot on a platform like this. Those were the caves I was hiding in. I didn't want people to see me because I thought they might see just how dumb I really am. How unintelligent book learned. I can't, how reading's a problem for me. That my eyes don't track right. How I don't always get words correctly. Those are the caves that I would hide in. And God brought me out in a similar way to Gideon, of just saying yes to little things and little things. And he slowly got me up on one of these raised things, playing music, and then sharing a little bit and talking. And friends, if I look at my story, I still don't know why I'm here. And often Satan comes and he tries to put me right back in that cave. And he tries to beat me back down and say, no, you can't do that. Why don't you go back to the cave where you belong? But he just, and I feel like Gideon, I've had steps back, but it's amazing what God can do when you just say yes. And say yes again, and say yes again, and say yes again, and I'm amazed at what he can do. And I can stand here and say that I'm able to do this not by any amount of my strength or wisdom or knowledge, because I don't have it. But I relate to that passage in Hebrews where out of weakness, I was made strong. Out of my weakness, I am made strong. Out of my weakness. That's every time you see me. Is my weakness. So I'll boast all the more in my weakness, because it's through my weakness that his power is made manifest in and through me. That can be your story. That can be your story. But you've got to start by standing up out of the cave and saying yes when God comes to you and says, "Oh, mighty man of valor, I got something for you." Yes. Yes. What do you need to say yes to? Maybe saying yes is for you today is to starts out by just giving up an addiction or something that has been holding you back. Maybe saying yes is to standing up in your life to people who are doing wrong, like Gideon had to do, stand up to his past. Maybe saying yes for today for you is to trusting God with something that's out of your control right now, and you've been trying to hold on to control of it, but for you it's to release that control. Maybe saying yes is for you is to put your faith completely in Jesus and stop riding the fence, but to put your faith completely in Jesus, knowing that putting your faith in Jesus is not just sitting down and saying, "I believe," but standing up and saying, "Whatever you have for me, I'm going to say yes." Maybe today it's just pre-saying yes. God, whatever it looks like, whatever you're going to call me to, I'm just going to say yes. I'm just going to say yes. And now you're already determined to do it. Maybe for you it's saying yes to getting more deeply involved with God's people, with ministry, with pouring your life into the mission that God has you on. Maybe saying yes is to go over to your neighbor who you know doesn't know the Lord, but you don't really know that well, but just to build a relationship with them. See what God's going to do through you just being a good neighbor and being faithful when he gives you the invitation to share the gospel. I don't know what it is for you and what it looks like to say yes, but I want to challenge you today. I want to challenge you because if Gideon can walk out of there and do what he did through God's power, and if I can stand here on Sunday mornings and do this thing that they call preaching, you can do whatever, I guarantee you. My sisters aren't here, but they would tell you if there was any, that was not going to happen for me, right? When I was growing up. But it's not me, it's him. And that can be your story. So I just want to say, faith looks a whole lot like saying yes. Will you say yes? And come out of your cave into this wild adventure that God's got for you. Let's pray. God, thank you. You are the only one worthy. Thank you for taking weak and ordinary people like Gideon, like Abraham, Moses, David, me, and through your strength doing something that we cannot do on our own. It is through your power and your might, not by ours. I just pray that we would be people, we would be yes people. That when you call, we would step into that. Even if we don't see how it's going to work out. Even if we don't see ourselves as the mighty man of valor or what you call, I pray that we would step in faith knowing what you've already won for us is greater than we could ever imagine. And it's by your strength, not by ours. God, we give these things to you in Jesus' name. Amen.